Hello, this is Lady Tehila from the Covenant of the Open Mind, Elder of the Open-Minded Path, and you're watching Metaphysics 101. Hail and welcome. The topic this time is string theory, the first of two lectures talking about the dual nature of the universe, or really how the universe exists in kind of a contradictory state. If you remember from the past two lectures, we've been talking about how the universe is one thing, how it comes from a single source, how it's really just a single explosion, how all of the fundamental forces and particles in physics are really united as energy, as one thing. And in this lecture and the next, we're going to kind of get away from that and talk about how the universe is both one and also dual and also discrete, and also there are individual things in the universe that function as individual things interacting with each other. How is that possible? This and the next lecture are both going to be very technical. This one's a little bit shorter. The next one's going to be very technical. And then we have one more where I will tie everything together, summarize it all, and really provide you guys with a theory of literally everything, including spirituality and religion. To start us off on the topic of string theory, I am going to step us through what is called Hawkins' 10-dimensional model of physics. There's lots of videos on this. My favorite one I will share as a link in the description, called 10 Dimensions Explained. And it really tries to break everything down as splits, lines, splits, and folds. Using the terminology lines, splits, and folds is convenient because it's easy to understand in a small number of dimensions, which is the number of dimensions we live in, and it allows for us to build the higher number of dimensions in a way that's more easily conceptually understood. So you can think about it like the first dimension is a single point in space. It's literally just a point, and then you have to have a second point, and then you can draw a line between them, and suddenly you have an object. So think of a sheet of paper, right? So if we have 2 points in space, then we have what is called width, right? We have a sheet of paper that spans a certain length, whatever. Length, width, and depth are all really just different descriptions for the physical dimensions that define matter, that define physical objects. And they're interchangeable. So it doesn't matter if you want to consider this the length, or this is the length, or whatever. It doesn't matter at all which one is the length, which one is the width, and which one is the depth. They're basically interchangeable, and which one you call which is entirely up to you. So if you have 2 points, then you have a line, okay? And that is like our first dimension here. Our first dimension is a line. If you have 3 points now, then you have a whole plane, a sheet, right? Now you have both a line and a point somewhere on that sheet. The third dimension is what's called a fold. And let me explain what that means. If there was an ant on this paper, an ant is really small, right? So for all intents and purposes, let's consider that the ant is two-dimensional, that the ant perceives of a two-dimensional world. Now let's say this ant crawls all the way along to the edge of this paper, and then we fold the paper back, and he crawls off, and then we unfold it. If the ant were really two-dimensional, then it would appear to him like he magically teleported from one part of the paper to another. We know that what really happened is we folded the paper through a higher dimension. We folded this two-dimensional paper through the third dimension. Folding it through the third dimension allows for the ant to magically appear in a new part of the paper. And that's what we mean when we say that the third dimension is a fold. So if we go up the dimensions, we start to find that the higher dimensions are not physical. It doesn't describe, an aspect of matter. The fourth dimension is temporal. It's time. So if you were to look at an object in 4 dimensions, you would see not just the paper here, you would also see the paper connected to a future point in time. Maybe you see the paper before there's anything written on it, and then at a future point in time, you see the paper with stuff written on it. And in between those 2 points is a line, a timeline. right? So the fourth dimension is a line. Now, in the fifth dimension, we have a split. There are many things that I could write on the paper, and those are different timelines. On the paper, I could write all of what I have here are equations and constants and things, or I could have drawn a pretty picture of flowers. Those are two different timelines, a split. We kind of touched on this in another lecture. We touched on this in the lecture where we talked about quantum mechanics and quantum weirdness. There's two timelines, and both of them are fundamentally the same. Either one of them could have happened. Each one of them has a probability of occurring. You know, we're sitting here talking about metaphysics, so what's the probability that I'm going to draw flowers on my paper? Probably I'm going to write physics on my paper, right? So that timeline where I write physics on the paper is more likely to happen. And that's the fifth dimension, a split in time. Just like how we had the second dimension is a split in physical space. So what's the sixth dimension? The sixth dimension is a fold in time. What does that mean? What does it mean to fold through time? We talked about this in the quantum weirdness lecture. We talked about it a little bit. The fold in time is when particles will select a different timeline from the present. So, you know, if this is the present state and these are the past here, then the particles can select one or the other from the present. They don't go back in time and then move forward along one timeline or the other. As we said in the past lecture, if they did that, we would know, we could measure that. What they do is they just pick a different history from the present. They fold through a higher number of dimensions than we can physically see. Just like the ant, to us, it seems like magic. But really, there's just a higher dimension that particles can make use of, and we can't. Why? Well, we talked about that too, if you remember, decoherence. Particles are small. Particles are tiny, tiny things that can exist in superpositions. Literally, the particles experience both timelines. The particles go down both. And then when we ask them to behave like a macroscopic object, when we ask them to choose a timeline, they do. They pick one or the other because that's what makes sense to us. Particles experience both because both timelines are just as real as each other. So there's an infinite number of timelines. There's an infinite number of ways that things could happen or could have happened. And the universe experiences all of them. This is what I mean when I say that there's a duality here that we have to understand and discuss. How is it possible for the universe to experience all of the possible timelines while we can't? That's the duality of the universe. Macroscopic objects, because of decoherence, which you can go back and watch the previous lectures to understand, macroscopic objects only experience one timeline or another. In our heads, we can experience other timelines, but you can't, like I said in a previous lecture, you can't wake up tomorrow and be a famous inventor. If you remember being a famous inventor, that's not good enough because the rest of us don't remember that. You'd have to go back in time, which you can't do, or you'd have to invent something. So if you wake up and suddenly have the knowledge of a famous inventor and then invent something, functionally it'll be the same. It's kind of the same as folding through 6 dimensions, but you didn't physically do it. You can't physically fold through 6 dimensions because you're too big. Particles can physically fold through 6 dimensions because they're smaller. The way to think about this is if you look at a cord or an electric line or a clothesline or rope of some kind that's hanging up from far away, it looks like a line. It looks like it's a 2-dimensional object, but it's really 3-dimensional. And if you were smaller, if you were an ant, say, then you could crawl around that cord and you would see the 3rd dimension. So this is the metaphysics from this concept. It's called concealment. And the term concealment is a Kabbalah term. And it really just describes the fact that the higher numbers of dimensions are concealed from us so that we don't observe them in daily life. Let's keep building up the number of dimensions, and then we'll come back and talk more about concealment. So we have, so far, a line, that's the first dimension, a split, that forms a plane, that's the second dimension, and a fold, the third dimension. In the fourth dimension, we have a timeline, which is a physical object, a three-dimensional object moving through time in one direction to a point in the future. And the fifth dimension is a split in time, two timelines, and the object could pick one or the other. It moves like this. Then the sixth dimension is a fold, jumping from one to the other, which we can't do, but particles can. So, what is the seventh dimension? The seventh dimension is a point connected to another point. But what is the point in this case? It's an entire universe, okay? It's an entire set of infinite timelines that describe an entire universe, the way that from the Big Bang onward, the universe can expand and evolve, and all the different various paths it can take, and it's infinite. And there's an infinite number of timelines within that universe, all based on a specific set of physical laws. The way that the fundamental forces described in the previous lecture behave, the number of particles, how the particles interact, all of the stuff that we talked about in the standard model lecture, that describes our universe's physics, the physics of our universe. And you can think about it like a marble. Okay, our universe is a marble, and in the center of that marble, there's a little colorful bit, right? That would be the string. That would be the shape of the string, the shape of the dark energy or whatever it's made of. The shape of the string determines the physics. If you remember back to when we talked about cosmology, when we talked about the Big Bang, we said that there are cosmological constants that affect how the universe evolves. Like, for instance, our universe isn't going to collapse in on itself because there's some kind of energy that's forcing it to expand at an accelerated rate, faster than gravity can pull it back into the center. That cosmological constant in cosmology is called the dark energy constant. The amount of dark energy in a universe determines the shape of that universe. Does it expand? Does it collapse on itself? Does it collapse immediately on itself because the universe is actually impossible to sustain? What does the universe look like? What does the physics look like? Now, there are an infinite number of marbles, and each marble has a different color and shape in the center of it. Each marble, each universe has an infinite number of timelines based on different physical laws. So in the eighth dimension, you have multiple marbles. And you have a split, once again, but this time in reality itself. So in the ninth dimension, you have a fold. A fold is pulling from one into the other. How do we do that? Through the imagination. Through your imagination, you can take something that is physically impossible, that can't exist based on our physics, and you can make it real here. You can be really afraid of the undead. You can be afraid of zombies. Zombies can't physically exist. There's no way for something that is dead to be animated. It's not possible. So, at least not in the way that they're depicted in popular media. Not based on our physical laws. It's just not possible. But you can take that idea and make it real. You can be really afraid of zombies. You can think that zombies are going to get you as you walk down the hall at night. You can see them even though they're not there. That's the imagination. That's what the imagination does. And that's the metaphysics side of this, okay? That's comparing what this physical model means to us, essentially. What does the fact that there are a higher number of dimensions mean to us? It means that we can take things that are not real, that are not even physically possible based on our physics, and make them real, even if they're still impossible. They can still really affect us. We can't physically make zombies. You can't just think about a zombie and suddenly there's a zombie physically in front of you. But you can be really afraid of them. You can make it real to you just by imagining it. Your mind, the part of you, if you recall back to when we talked about randomness, when we talked about the chakras, the electrical centers, the part of you that is essentially an electrical field, the part of you that is not physical, that is metaphysical, that is subject to experiencing influence from outside of your physical form, that part of you can perceive of alternate timelines and alternate realities. You can't physically travel to an alternate timeline or an alternate reality because you're too big. But mentally, inside of your mind, inside of your nervous system, that's just made of particles. Particles are small. Particles can experience quantum weirdness. Particles are susceptible to influence in quantum perturbations. And that allows you to perceive of higher numbers of dimensions, even though you can't physically experience them. Okay, now it's important to talk about something. Where are the higher dimensions? Where do they exist? They're not physical, so it's not a place that you can travel to. It's not like there's a bunch of universes, a bunch of marbles in a bowl sitting somewhere in space. The alternate timelines and alternate realities are consequences of the dual nature of our universe, of the fact that it is both discrete, that it's confined into a physical state, and it's not. All of these other dimensions, all of the other timelines and realities take up the same space. They're everywhere. Everything you see is 10-dimensional. You just don't see the higher dimensions because of decoherence. You don't see the higher dimensions because they're not physical. Particles see the higher dimensions. Other aspects of physics in other realms behave in ways that don't really make sense to us because they can experience a different number of dimensions. Time and space stop existing for particles. They're everywhere in time and space at the same time. The physics on these different scales is literally different. And in the alternate universes, the physics is physically different, based on different physical laws that function differently because of the different amount of matter and energy that those universes contain. There's no physical process that we see right now that experiences different realities, except potentially black holes, which we can't see into, which we don't understand, as we discussed in a previous lecture. It's distinctly possible that you could travel to another reality by traveling into a black hole, except as we discussed, you can't travel into a black hole because you would be destroyed, A. B, time stops passing as you approach the singularity, so you would never reach the singularity, and for a whole bunch of paradoxical reasons. You can't travel into a black hole, but assuming you could, maybe you'd come out into another universe with different physical laws on the other side. So these dimensions and these alternate realities and these alternate timelines are not physical, and they exist everywhere. They take up the same space. And that's why we have these experiences that really don't make sense and that defy reason, that defy the laws of physics. This is where intuitive, personal perspective and experience comes from. This is where you can have a dream that just defies everything that you know to be true and all of the physical laws that you know to exist. Because they don't really exist. They do, and they don't. There's no amount of convincing yourself that matter is just energy that will allow you to magically teleport from one space to another. There's no amount of convincing yourself that reality doesn't exist that will allow you to create an undead being. There's no amount of wishing that will make something that isn't real or even impossible possible or real. There's no amount of that. We will talk about how you can make use of this information in order to change the nature of your reality. But it doesn't happen through some kind of crazy magical depiction like you see in popular media. That is really just pulling from some reality where physics is different. And in this reality, that's not how physics works. And this reality is the most real. Why is this reality the most real? Because we say it is. because we are here to observe it. In other realities where physics is different, life may not even be possible. In most of them, life is not possible. Most of the alternative forms of physics cause the universes to collapse on themselves faster than makes sense. Just like how our universe can expand faster than light can travel, which should hypothetically violate the laws of physics, but it doesn't, because the universe doesn't have to obey the same laws of physics. The universe can fold through higher dimensions. The universe can do things that physical objects can't. Even photons, even light, right, is just a physical thing. It's a manifestation. It's a concealment of the higher planes of existence into a finite thing, something that you can measure, that you can look at, that you can observe to exist. The universe technically doesn't exist that way. Technically, nothing exists, and yet it does. And that is the duality of existence. That is the duality of the universe. The universe is one, and the universe is dual. Even though it contradicts, even though it doesn't really make any sort of rational sense, it doesn't have to, because the universe is beyond sense. It is only through the concealment of the higher dimensions that we are able to have any kind of logic or sense at all. All of our understanding of logic, all of our understanding of everything comes as observers within the universe. In the next lecture, we will talk about what it means to be a universe observing itself. And then we'll talk about the consequences of that reality. So I know that this is complete nonsense, but I hope that it made sense to you. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop a comment on this video. Join our community, openmindedpath.com for the link to that. And from everyone here at the Covenant of the Open Mind, blessed be.